Um, hello, everybody. People should now be coming into the room. Do bear with us. For everybody's benefit, my name is Geraldine from London Funders, and really pleased today to be bringing some fabulous people from across our membership who've been so involved in governance in the past year under COVID-19. So we're just waiting for you all to come through. In the meantime, if you'd like to follow us on Twitter at London Funders and tweet #LondonLearnFest, that would be absolutely brilliant. And we are just waiting to be joined by one of our panelists, so do bear with us. And also just to say that my colleague James will be popping in the chat the link to the London LearnFest website for you all to have a look at all of the other sessions that are completely free for all of our London Funders members, which of course I would say as our membership manager. So yeah, thank you ever so much. Whilst we have technical difficulties with one of our panelists, I'm actually going to promote our Chief Executive, James Banks, to chair the session in the meantime. Just to say, so looking forward to hearing all the insights from local and independent trusts and foundations, as well as a borough.
Good afternoon, everybody. Apologies for the slight technical difficulties we're having there. It's great to have you all with us this afternoon. I'm James, I'm Chief Executive at London Funders, and to the surprise of my panel, I'm jumping in to chair the session just while we're having some difficulties with Edith. It's fantastic to have such a fantastic group of people on the panel for today's session, and it's also wonderful to see so many of you in the audience this afternoon as well. This is one of the sessions that's part of the Festival of Learning, where, as Geraldine says, we're trying to bring together a lot of insights from the last year, a lot of what's worked, a lot of what we've learnt along the way, to try and provide a platform for progressive and positive change for the future, building on all of that learning and thinking about how we can move forward as a funding sector to support our communities through recovery, renewal and beyond. You're joining the session in a webinar format, so you can see me and you can see the panelists, but we sadly can't see you. But what we would encourage you to do is join in, share any resources or insights you have through the chat box that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And if you have any questions you'd like to ask our panelists, please use the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom as well, and we'll come to that as we go through. So this session is all looking about how we've led the crisis as part of our leadership session, and it's fantastic to have people with us today who are chaired from different perspectives, who many of you will know, and you'll, I'm sure, have seen their biographies and will know they're impressive people in their own right, but also their organisations have all done impressive things over the course of the year, whether that's through a local authority context, through to the regional level as funders, or indeed looking at some of the national context, as well as how people have responded through in London. So I'm really pleased that we've got them with us, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves as part of their first answers, if I may. So we've got a few questions that are going to kick off that conversation, but as I say, do pop your own questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll make sure we come to those as part of the session as well. So the first question that we asked our panelists to reflect on in advance is just looking back at the previous year, what had worked well for them and what had worked well for their organisation. And if I could ask you, as you're responding to that, just to give us a brief snippet of what your organisation does and achieves, just so we can put it in that context as well. Ruth, do you mind if I come to you first for that one from the local authority take?
That's fine, James. Thanks. And hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. So my name's Councillor Ruth Donby, and I'm leader of the Council London Borough of Sutton. That's 210,000 people in southwest London. I can't give a snippet of what we do, James, because we provide 800 different services, which goes from nurseries to cemeteries and virtually everything in between. And I think one of the learning from the last 12, 14 months is that people now start to understand the importance of social care and what local government does for social care. We provide things that people want, like housing benefit, and things that people don't want, like parking fines. So some of you will have an idea of what local government does, some of you won't. It very much depends if you have children with special needs, if you have elderly relatives who need extra support. But it's really, I mean, I wanted to thank you for inviting me, because it's given me an opportunity to step back a little bit and think about the past year, because it has been pretty full on. And if you're asking me what worked really well, I need to talk about partnership, because of all the things that's happened, I think it's the strength of our partnership that has actually given us the strength to get through and to be where we are. Partnership with all our partners, but especially the voluntary and community sector. And I'm not just saying that because this is an event hosted by London funders. It's because we have a very, very strong partnership working here in Sutton. And just to give a very quick example, because I know there's lots of members of the panel. The very first few days when we knew we were going into lockdown, the first thing I did was to convene a meeting of all our main voluntary sector partners to agree how we would work together. And we agreed that we would play to our strengths. So the voluntary sector, the community sector have a reach into the community that meant that we were able to not just find volunteers, but also to reach out people who needed extra help. And we concentrated on providing the organisation, the coordination, the back office support, and doing a lot of the comms as well. Setting up the food distribution hub, exactly the same thing again. We asked the volunteer centre to organise all the volunteers. We did everything else. And as time has gone by, we're handing over more and more with the appropriate funding to the voluntary sector, so that they are more resilient going forward and are leading on these services. And the money is absolutely key to all of this. So we've been able to allocate and distribute some of the COVID grants, but it is about what our community needs, what our residents need. And we've had really positive conversations with different parts of civil society about which organisation could best help the rest of us to fulfil the needs of particular groups of people. So I'll leave it there, James, because I know lots of other people want to come in.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ruth. I think it's really impressive to see that local authority response and the emphasis on partnership there. And we've certainly heard from talking to groups across London how important that relationship between local authorities and civil society has been over the last year. And it's good to have seen that from the governance perspective as well, in terms of leading a council. Edith joined us, but just to give her a bit of a rather than a baptism of fire, I'll continue chairing this question, and then I'll hand on to Edith at the end of it. And Drew, I'm wondering if I can come to you next, because obviously you also have an awareness from the Corporation of London perspective, but also particularly through the City Bridge Trust efforts over the last year in terms of collaboration and leading through crisis. What have been some of the things that you've reflected on over the last year that's worked well, or you've learnt from?
So I'm an elected member of the City of London Corporation, so we have local authority functions like any other local authority. But the reason why I'm here is my role as latterly chairman of the City Bridge Trust, which is the funding arm of our overarching charity, in which the corporation is the corporate trustee called Bridge House Estates. So City Bridge Trust gives away around about 25 million to causes in London, addressing inequality, disadvantage, all of those kind of big things. In terms of the what's worked well, one of the first things I did when I took over as chairman was to increase our level of delegations. So that means that actual staff members or the staff team can make decisions at a much higher level on giving out grants, and that kind of, I think, served us really well in the pandemic in terms of being able to kind of get decisions made more quickly, rather than having to refer to the committee every time they wanted to do something. And then also going to our values. So I'll focus on two of our values. First one, adaptive. And I think we've had to really use this in terms of we've made one-off grants to current organisations, currently funded organisations during the pandemic. We've allowed funded organisations to use programmatic funding for core funding, which has really helped. And then another one of our values is collaborative. So we've we during the pandemic, we really pivoted our offer, setting up the London Community Response Fund, focusing our efforts on getting that off the ground within weeks, and a real joint legal effort to get that all up and running. And then also in terms of getting unusual funders on board, such as business foundations, and engaging equity and inclusion partners. So we've really tried to use that collaborative value as well to good effect during the past year.
Fantastic, thanks, Stu. I think the importance of that leadership, both of an own organisation, but also thinking about that sort of leadership role within networks as well, and how people are brought together. And if you haven't seen Drew's article in Civil Society this week, that touches on some of the themes of what we've learned over the last year as well. So do check that out. Russell, I'm wondering if I can come to you next. Obviously, with that London perspective, London Community Foundation has a really interesting position within that, both the collaborator regionally, but also that real strong local connection as well. How's it been for you over the last year?
Thanks, James, and great to join you today. So my role at London Community Foundation is Chair of Trustees. And I guess when I look back over the past year, two big thoughts. One is, it's kind of quite hard to remember where we were right back at the beginning of this. And if you try and put yourself back in that position and ask, what went well against what you knew then, it's quite different from if you answer the question from where we are today, because we've learned so much so quickly. And then the second thing for me personally was that I had just been chair for 3 months when COVID kind of pandemic really hit us. So it's been an interesting 12 months to say the least. I think there are 3 important things that I would reflect from what we've learned at LCF. One is that right at the beginning, we set out for ourselves what we described as a set of strategic grant principles. And we said, look, we don't quite know what's going to happen, but if LCF is going to respond, what would LCF want to do? And I think looking back, it's been amazing how we've stayed true to those and how they were a really good reflection of what LCF is as an organisation and what it does in London. So things like, and some of them are just restatements of the really important things you do as an organisation. So saying things like, we'll put grassroots community-led organisations at the heart of our response. We'll direct funds to communities disproportionately affected by COVID. Recognise the need to support infrastructure and capacity. Those are things that, they're right at the heart of what we do, but it was really important to reassert those as being really important. But then balancing that with other things like the need to be flexible, partnership, as Ruth said, is a word that we've reflected really hard on. But also then saying, what can we do as an organisation that's going to be proportionate for what we are as an organisation in terms of our staff, in terms of our own resources? How can we respond in a way that recognises where we sit? So that was one. The second one was a desire to be part of a collective effort. So we were part of a big funding effort through London Community Response. And to be honest with you, that was a game changer in terms of speed, flexibility, collaboration. And then the third one I would just mention very briefly is that a lot of our donors showed a willingness to be much more open-minded about how they would work. So they were more open to collaboration, they were more open to taking on new ideas and to funding slightly differently. And I think the combination of all of that meant that in the last 12 months, we were able to distribute more than double the amount of funds we would do in an ordinary year, but under very stressful working conditions for the organisation and our team. So I think that's how I would assess what's gone well.
Thanks, Russell. And I have to say, from the outside, London Community Foundation have played a blinder, as I believe the expression is, in terms of the last year, just in terms of how you've managed to marshal resources from your sort of existing donor base, but also manage National Emergencies Trust money that's come through. And there's a whole load of stuff that your team have been involved in. It's been wonderful to see. So thank you again for joining us. Andrew, I'm conscious actually, Clothworkers, you've been a fantastic partner within London when we've looked at the London Community Response, but you've also been very active at the national level in terms of different funder collaborations and responding to COVID. So how's it been on your side?
Thanks, James. Yeah, certainly a lot of what Drew and Russell have said resonates with us. So the Clothworkers Foundation gives away £6-7 million a year nationally to a very broad range of causes. We're primarily a funder of capital projects, although we do have some proactive programs currently in the fields of care leavers, disadvantaged youth and visual impairment overseas. I think the events of the past year have certainly been a catalyst for us to look at our processes and practices in terms of things like approachability, approvals, delegation levels, and monitoring requirements. A positive, I suppose, from the need to hold meetings remotely was a realization that it gave us a lot more flexibility in not being bound by scheduled committees and grant approval cycles. And operationally, we were quite fortunate in that we were already set up to be able to work remotely from home and access all files. So that enabled us to respond quickly without any hiatus. Like many funders, we reached out to grantees to say, we would be sympathetic to particular circumstances. And as a result, we waived a lot of grant conditions, agreed reallocation of proceeds, things like that. I suppose we surprised ourselves by our willingness for what is quite a conservative foundation to act boldly and quickly in response to the pandemic, releasing endowment funds, taking greater risks, adopting a lighter touch, and also the unanimity of the board in supporting all of this, which was very positive. And as with City Bridge, the board delegated considerable authority in part to the 4 trustees who make up the grants committee, and that enabled us to respond very quickly to initiatives like the NET and the LCRF, and at a meaningful level. And that flexibility also gave us the ability to set up our own program to provide small grants up to 5,000 to small charities for capital requirements urgently needed to allow charities to continue delivering services or delivering them in a different way. And that was mainly IT kit and kitchen equipment. And that had, the application form was short. We gave a decision within 3 weeks, funds were dispersed quickly, and there were minimal reporting requirements. So that was a successful program. Management had the ability to approve all the grants without referral to any trustee body. That sped up the decision making further, and it only had a 3-month life, but it distributed 1.1 million to over 330 small, medium-sized charities. So that was a real positive. Similar to City Bridge, as it became clear that communities experiencing racial inequality were being impacted disproportionately by the pandemic, and also that domestic violence was sadly rocketing, the trustees made a decision to release a further £1 million from the expendable endowment and engaged with community organisations reaching those sectors to allow us to distribute funds needed urgently to help both small and medium-sized organisations in those communities and individuals being affected by domestic violence.
Thank you, Andrew. I think again from the outside, seeing what can be achieved by both a relatively small staff team and a small governance team actually working together in that way and challenging yourselves to be open and trusting within that has been really impressive to see as well. So thank you for the work you've done. Edith has fantastically joined us. Edith's Vice Chair of the Board of London Funders. So having done the positive, what worked well over the last year question, I will now hand over to her to take you through the rest of them. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion that follows. Edith.
Thank you, James, and apologies for my IT issues, meaning that it was a bit difficult for me to get in. The next question is, what didn't go as well as you expected? And I think I can answer that even after a year, assuming IT is going to work without a fault is probably something that is going to happen. So yeah, I've learned from that, and I will be earlier with my links. So I'd like to open it up to the panel again. So the next question is, what didn't go as well as you expected, and what have you learned from this? So Ruth, would you like to start with your response on that? You're on mute, Ruth. I'm glad you've just done that to make me feel better, haven't you?
Of course I did, Edith. I did it deliberately, most definitely. And apparently I now owe £1 to RNID, which is absolutely fine. So yeah, what I'm about to say, Edith, I think will resonate with you as you also work in the London Borough. As well as being leader of a London council, I'm also one of the vice chairs of London councils, which means that over the last 14 months, I've had lots and lots of meetings with the mayor and the GLA and also with government ministers. For me, the hardest part, which didn't go well, although it is improving now, was having to implement at short notice decisions that ministers had made in response to data that wasn't always widely available or widely understood. And while it may have looked sensible from Whitehall or from the centre, it didn't always seem so logical in the context of local circumstances. And let's be honest, during the pandemic, the government has taken on increasingly more and more powers. So there were times when we were obliged to do things that we could see there would be a better way of achieving the same outcome. I think the remarkable conclusion is that in our borough, our partnerships didn't crumble under the pressure, in spite of the additional pressures that we were put under, and that we had good enough relationships to be open with each other and get on with what we needed to do. And I do think there has been a shift now. There's a growing recognition that local works better. There's still vast amounts of central control, central interference, constant demands for data gathering. But I think Whitehall has finally understood that we know our communities best and that we can work more effectively with civil society to engage with our residents better and quicker, and to also make sure that we are reaching, as I said, those parts of the community where COVID has had more of a disproportionate impact. And that's around surge testing, vaccine hesitancy, but also working with our businesses and hospitality sector. I think what local government has been doing is now being recognised because of the pandemic, that actually we have better connections locally, and sometimes more central, let's say Whitehall needs to stand back and leave us to get on with it.
Thank you, and absolutely, I think that does resemble a lot of what we've seen in Redbridge as well on that level. So that's really helpful. Thank you. Rev, would you like to come in to talk about it from the City Bridge Trust angle?
Yeah, so there's 2 or 3 things I could mention. One of the things is that there were obviously points where many of our kind of colleagues and staff were really at capacity and at risk of burnout. So, and one of the things that we did do, but probably didn't do as quickly as we could have done, was to use consultants and freelancers to manage the workloads. So, for example, with our work on racial justice, we got in a partner to kind of a consultant to kind of manage that particular work stream for us, and that kind of helped relieve some of the pressure elsewhere on the staff team. And then also in terms of our collaboration work, accessing partners while they were busy and couldn't really afford to spend time with single funders was difficult, and putting together equity partner funding panels to get involved in decision making made a lot of difference. But both of those things were quite difficult to resource, and I think we would have to look at how we could resource those better in future.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, just getting off mute there. That's really interesting, talking about the collaboration of partners and how to think about how to align those resources so that we're maximising the time when everybody's so much under pressure. Because even though with technology you can create more meetings just fills up the day even more, doesn't it? And it just takes up that time. So it's really important to get as much value out of that time as possible. Andrew, could I bring you in on the same question then? What didn't go as well as expected, and what have you learned from that?
Yep, thanks. Well, I suppose like most organisations, the switch to online meetings was initially a bit of a challenge for us, and the lack of physical interaction was really a constraint on the ability of board members to bond and have informal conversations. And it also made the induction of new trustees quite difficult. I think chairing Zoom meetings required quite a different skill set to ensure that all those who wish to contribute had a chance to do so. Staff certainly became more adept at the technology during the year, and that allowed us to make better use of the capabilities of Zoom and Teams and make meetings work better. And I think now that we've become more familiar with the technology and how to conduct ourselves in those meetings, we found they can work well. And I think going forward, we'll probably adopt a hybrid using the best of both. We had done a thorough review of our governance back in 2019, and that had helped streamline and improve some of our processes. And one of the outcomes of that review was a decision to improve the diversity of our board. We were frankly behind the curve on this, and I think used the pandemic as an excuse to defer recruitment of new blood. I'm glad to say since then we've made some progress, and 3 new external trustees joined the board at the beginning of this year, which is great. If they had been on board a year earlier, it is conceivable that elements of our response might have been different, but we'll never know.
That's really interesting, and definitely that piece about how to understand the physical cues and how to have those conversations, and to really understand, especially when all of our work relies on partnerships and relationships and collaboration so much. It's been really, really difficult to kind of reach through the screen to be able to do that, even with our residents and our smaller groups as well. Thank you. So Russell, can I bring you in for the same question, please?
Sure. Look, unsurprisingly, I'd share many of the thoughts expressed by the other panelists. I think with Andrew, some of those issues around meetings, new trustees, we brought on board a number of new trustees. Staying with staff induction is a real challenge. I guess I'd just highlight a couple of other things. One is, I think this has shone a very bright light on some of the issues that we have operationally as a community foundation, that I think, in years gone by, people have either accepted or said, no, they're not high enough priority. I think when you relook at these things under stress conditions, like a crisis like this, I think it just gives you a different lens on some of those issues. So I think one of the things coming out of this that we're doing is seeing how we can address those things that we probably accepted for too long, but actually are really quite fundamental. And given the agility we have seen, how can we embed that as a long-lasting impact? So that would be one. And then the other one I would just highlight is, at a time where everybody's interest is in trying to do so much, for positive benefit to help, actually, when do you say no to some things? And that was quite challenging at times. Seemingly good things that you'd want to do, when you address them in the round and say, is this really the right thing to be doing in terms of all of the stakeholders to a given decision? That was quite tough. And I think a few instances where we've learned that actually saying no is not the wrong thing to do, recognizing when it's right for you to do something as an organization, and maybe leave others to pick up on other opportunities or other demands. So again, those would just be 2 additional things I would highlight. And finally, just it re-emphasized for us the importance of having those strategic principles for our approach, because when there was some difficulty, the board and the staff management work could unify around those things we agreed as being what our priorities are.
Thank you, and thank you all for your honesty in that space. I think sometimes it's difficult to state those areas of challenge, and I think what you've said, all of you there, in terms of operational challenge and collaboration challenges, are things that everyone has been facing in the last year, and so it's quite reassuring to know that we're all in the same boat together, and that we're all learning from it. And certainly, Russell, your point there about what to say no to is really pertinent, because we've seen that the relationships have moved to a much more adult relationship, less parent-child, and it is people are stepping into that space and really excelling, and we're seeing our communities really grow. And I think that's really, really important. And I think, yeah, but I appreciate your candid responses there. That's really good, and I'm sure our webinar watchers will like that as well. So going on that view of honesty, I'm going to ask you to look at yourselves as individuals a little bit, which is always a bit tricky in these public spaces. But what did you learn about leadership through the last year? And how do you think your leadership style has changed through the crisis? this is a three-part question. So what did you learn about your leadership style? How has your leadership style changed through the crisis? And how will you use that learning for the renewal ahead? And how will we go? I'm not going to come to you first, Ruth, because you seem to be the first one on everything. So I'm going to mix it up a bit. And I'm going to come to you, Andrew, just to keep you all on your toes so that we're mixing up who's answering questions first. So Andrew, can I bring you in again, please?
Okay, thanks, Edith. Yeah, I think exceptional times call for bold leadership, and sometimes that means with a conservative board that you need one or two trustees to stick their heads above the parapet and propose what might be seen by others as radical steps. I think it also means ensuring that you're listening and collaborating, taking full account of what others are doing in the sector to see where we could usefully contribute. And I think, going back to what I said in the last question, chairing and participating in meetings over Zoom is no substitute for face-to-face interaction in terms of effective debate and engagement, although some trustees, I think, do feel more comfortable contributing online, especially those who maybe are more recent members of the board. And having brought in external trustees for the first time, we need to make sure that we give them the space so that their voices can be heard, which I think is very important. Looking to the future, I think there may be a temptation for some trustees to feel that having drawn on reserves to help fund our response to the pandemic, and with the likelihood of uncertain investment returns over the next few years, that we should rein in grant budgets. And I think it's going to require quite firm chairmanship to counter such a view, given the continuing pressure that charities are obviously feeling in the face of surging demand and declining income.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really helpful, and I think that last point is a challenging one. Absolutely, with the amount of recovery that we've got over the next couple of years, there is a risk, and I know there'll be many organisations reliant on funding that will be concerned about what those futures hold and how they've had to rearrange. So that is a difficult decision for any board to make, and definitely one I'm sure a number of people are facing at the moment. So in the spirit of keeping people on their toes, I'm going to bounce back to Russell now to give the others a bit of time to respond as well.
Sure. So my reflection on this was that, as ever in an ideal world, what you'd be seeing is, clear, decisive, supportive leadership. And then there's the sort of reality of what happens when it's all under pressure. And I think the things I've kind of would reflect back on. One is the importance of kind of communication. The second one is the importance of using the governance mechanisms you have. And the third one, which is a bit contrary, is to recognise that, if you're going to move at speed, you're not necessarily going to please everybody all of the time. And I think that having a bit of an awareness of that, and then sort of having some counterbalancing strategies for that, is probably quite helpful. So the communication, just on the communication point, I think we've tried very hard wherever we can to demonstrate that the decisions that have been taken in the context of a strategy that was agreed up front, so that people can see that there is that clarity of linkage through the decisions back to the strategy. I think from a governance perspective, and I'll say this more at the trustee level, I think the staff team and leadership at that level have done a remarkable job. But at the governance level, I think we've seen trustees much more active in a broader, deeper use of the governance mechanisms we have, and so that has been really helpful. I think trustees generally have sort of stepping up to more involvement, to more support, to being available. I think that's been an absolutely tremendous aspect. Then if I look forward, there's a couple of reflections on that. One would be, what you do in a crisis isn't necessarily what you want to do in a more business as usual environment. Now, I'm not suggesting we're going to go straight back to business as usual, because there is a big recovery phase, of course. But I think recognizing that as we changed up, you might need to change again. You can't just assume that the reaction through the crisis is the one to carry forward. It's about, I think, pulling out the lessons from that, and then kind of going back to what's proportionate between the respective roles of the different levels within the organisation, and what's right for the organisation and the context within it which it works moving forward.
Great, thank you very much. That's really interesting and really helpful to give that sense that you're building the role of trustee. James is taking notes, I'm sure, and he's going to be coming to us with more work. So thanks for that, Russell. But I think that's absolutely right. It has been a bit of an all hands on deck, and we've all had to think about what our roles and responsibilities are and how we need to function. And I think that's really, really good insight there. Drew, would you like to come in to see what you'd like to share about your area before we go on to Ruth, please?
Yeah, so I think for me personally, I think I've got better at knowing when to kind of lean in and get involved, and when to kind of step back and allow the team to do what they know how to do best. You know, just in terms of the different pressures and different ways of working, I think it's allowed me to kind of reflect on that a bit better. And then also one of the things I was thinking is it's much harder to chair meetings and encourage contribution in video calls. I think some of the other panelists have touched on that, certainly than when we've got physical meetings. It's difficult to sense the energy mood of the room, and you know, I'm personally really looking forward to returning, albeit more likely to be in a kind of hybrid format, but at least to have a few people in the room and a bit of that energy. Did you, sorry Edith, did you want me to cover some stuff about the leadership style, or is that going to come afterwards?
Yeah, please. Yeah, let's bring in the leadership style here. That would be really good. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I tried to do was, you know, once the pandemic happened, it was a lot harder to kind of keep in touch with, you know, what was happening in the office, and, you know, you couldn't just sort of pop in and see how things were or whatever. So I started attending the regular weekly staff meetings just to keep in touch with, you know, how the team are feeling and things, and keep my finger on the pulse. The other thing is that during the period where the schools were closed down, and, you know, myself and my wife, we were doing homeschooling and things, I think that personally gave me more empathy with team members who are going through kind of similar experiences during the pandemic. So yeah.
Thank you. And with 2 kids under the age of 5, I greatly appreciate that consideration to those colleagues, because certainly most of my organisation have met my children in some form of undress in the past year. Ruth, could I bring you in on that question, please?
I was smiling, Edith, because listening to what Ruth was saying, I'm a school governor, and there's a lot more empathy with teachers right now, because as the children went back to school, I think there's a new appreciation for what teachers do, which is good to see. I mean, I mentioned before that I'm involved not just at a borough level, but also at a London level, and I think leading across those 3 dimensions has been tricky and has taught me a lot about myself and how I work under pressure. It's not just about what's the right thing to do, of course, it's the right way to do it, and then it has been, as has been said, how to communicate it. And I think one of the things I've learned is that playing on those multiple stages during an emergency, you need to be more ruthlessly focused on what really matters, and be prepared, as you were saying, to say no, to let some things go, to delegate more, to understand what needs doing now, what can be left, and what indeed might be changed out of all recognition going forward by the pandemic and after the pandemic, and possibly need to come back and think from scratch again. So it's about introducing that level of flexibility and nimbleness that certainly within local government, I don't think are adjectives that we use too often to describe ourselves. And we're having a really interesting conversation about a London-wide recovery, what that means. There's inevitably a focus on inner London and the central activity zone, and we all understand the importance of those areas and the engine of our economy in London and indeed the country. But I feel I've been able to champion outer London in a way that probably I wasn't doing before, and to bring a different voice, a stronger voice about how people's expectations have changed now that they've discovered that you don't necessarily have to get on an overcrowded, smelly train at 7 o'clock in the morning every day in order to earn a decent wage. So there's a new conversation going on, and I think my leadership skills have changed as a result. I've got a very consensual, very inclusive style of leadership, and I've got a stronger voice now. I'm more trusting of my own judgment. I'm prepared to speak up more and listen to what people are saying, but point out that what they're saying isn't necessarily true for everyone. So there's been a lot of learning as far as I'm concerned as well.
Thank you very much. Apologies, because I obviously was not here at the beginning of the session. I had some wonderful introductory banter based on Glastonbury Festival as well that we've all missed out on. I'm sure you're very sorry to have missed it. But I should have also said, if James did not, that if anybody who's watching has any questions for the panel, we are going to open up to some of your questions, and I will ensure that there is time to do so. So please do put them in the question and answer part of the chat function so it doesn't get lost in the other comments, and we'll make sure we'll bring some of those questions in. With that in spirit, we had 2 more questions left for the panel based on my questions that I've been given as chair and host. So what I'm going to do is split those up 2 and 2 so that we've got time for other people's questions, because I can already see that there's a couple in there and I don't want to miss out on the opportunity of some of those. So unless anyone's going to leap at me from the panel saying they want to answer one of questions 4 or 5, I'll pick on people again. I will go to you, Russell, for no other reason than I haven't seen your face in a little while. And could you possibly answer us, thinking about the future, what would you like to change both at an organisational and a sector level as a result of your learning from the last year?
Yeah, so I guess it would be great to take forward some of those things that we've seen change for the better during the crisis. So I think some of the collaboration that we've seen with other funders in London, I think it'd be great to see that continue, whether that's in the work we do at the public sector, with public sector organisations, corporates, individuals, other foundations. I think there's been some really great stuff in that space. It would be a real shame to sort of lose that and go backwards. I'd say the same thing in relation to some of the changes we've seen by some of the funders we work with in terms of their flexibility, making funding more accessible, and particularly if I think of some of the corporate and individual funders, not just reverting to their old priorities, recognising that the needs have changed in some respects in London, and actually there's an opportunity for them to change. And then I think at an organisation level, we're working really hard on how can we embed some of the positive changes, how can we address some of the areas that I was talking about in answer to previous question, and I think particularly around the equity and diversity lens, we've seen the enormous importance of that through crisis. So again, how can we give real focus to that in terms of the way we work, literally right through the organisation from top to bottom. So whether that's diversity at the trustee board level, right through to some of our processes and procedures. How do we make sure that real focus on equity and diversity through everything we do? So those would be just three things I would highlight.
Thank you, Russell. Do you want to come in on that question as well, please? Thanks,
Edith. Yeah, so I've been doing quite a lot of thinking about this, and I think James mentioned the article that I put in the online, I think one of the reflections that I've had is during the Second World War, there was the William Beveridge report on social policy, which created a blueprint which would reshape post-war Britain and lay the foundations for the NHS. And I think in a similar way, as the country now emerges from one of the greatest challenges it's faced since the war, we've got a real opportunity to rebuild and reimagine the way services are provided by the charity sector, and how they should be funded and delivered in the future. I think it's really crucial that funders such as City Bridge Trust lead the way. So some of the things that we've done are cutting red tape and easing the burden of applying for grants and reporting on funded projects. So particularly through some of the work on LCRF and having a single kind of application form, a more flexible approach to grant giving, more core funding, We've used kind of startup strategies such as pivoting and testing and discover, which, you know, we've used quite effectively, I think, and, you know, could have been very difficult in a bureaucratic organization pre-pandemic, but I want to kind of keep hold of those in a way. And then just generally working more collaboratively, particularly using other funders and linking into infrastructure and anchor organizations.
Thank you so much for that. I'm very conscious of time, and I'm having James message me to say we will be finishing at 4 minutes too. So with our remaining few minutes, I'm going to ask Andrew and Ruth just to come in very briefly with one piece of knowledge about leadership that you would like to share before we open it up to the other questions of the group. So Andrew, would you like to come in first?
Yeah, sure. Very simply, don't underestimate your fellow trustees' ability to step up to take difficult decisions in unusual times.
James, stop taking notes. Ruth, can I hand over to you, please?
I'll try and be as quick. I think efforts spent on building and nurturing partnerships and trust are worth every minute, every effort and every penny. Leaders need to front the collective effort to communicate and build trust, but behind every leader there needs to be a collective voice and a collective will. And I don't think that's something that you can create during an emergency. It's work that has to be in place so that then you can cope with the emergency better. I think we're stronger when we work well together and we have a common purpose, and that's come out really strongly during the pandemic.
Great, thank you ever so much. We have had a couple of questions come in, so I'm going to take one from Sarah Ridley first. Ridley, apologies. She says, thank you for your honest responses to the questions so far. In relation to your governance responsibilities during the pandemic, can you identify the assistance you most needed or wanted from your executive staff to support you in your roles? Is there anybody that wants to jump in on that one in the first instance?
Yeah, I'm happy to say something, Edith.
Thank you, Russell. You knew I was going to pick on you.
Yeah, no, I'd turn it around actually, if that's not too cheesy or cheeky. And actually the question we were asking constantly to our executive and leadership was, what can we do to support you? Actually, as trustees, you know, with the governance mechanism, what can we do to make it more effective and easy for you to operate? And actually, I think that was the way. Oh, anyway, that's my perception of the way we've tackled that issue.
Great. Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah, Andrew, just click in. I think to be fully aware of the pressures on staff, which echoes really what Russell was saying, and not impose demands which actually detract from them doing the job they're paid to do and deliver services.
Great, thank you ever so much. I will just have a look to see what some of the other questions in. So somebody stated, I was at the new leaders session last week where mental health came up as a topic. How have you looked after your own well-being whilst juggling your leadership responsibilities? Perhaps I can bring Ruth in on that one first.
Thanks, Edith, and I'm really pleased it's been raised. It's so important. I've attended several meetings and seminars with people working at the local mental health trust, and we've all agreed that there are levels of stress and anxiety amongst all of us within the community that we haven't seen before. Some of us are coping a bit better, but that stress is there. As an organisation, we've done a lot around mental health and first aid. So we've encouraged our elected members and also members of staff to do various courses on mental health first aid. And I have on a tab up on my computer at all times a website called Good Thinking, which I find really helpful to go and refer to now and again. And I keep referring to it, as I've just done now, reminding people what a useful website it is and how it helps to give a balance and a sense of priority to some of the work that we're doing. It's been incredibly stressful, but I think there is a lot of help out there, and we need to encourage all our members of staff and the people we work with to take up the offer of help. I think the mantra, it's okay not to be okay, is really important. There's still sadly some stigma attached to mental health, and people don't really give it that parity of esteem that we should. So the fact that we're talking so openly, we have actually managed to do this before the pandemic hit. We have a an emotional resilience counsellor, someone that can help you when you're in crisis in all our secondary schools in the borough. And that has proved an absolute godsend, because we've got many young people going back to school, particularly secondary age children, who are really struggling with the situation. And to be able to give them that support before they go into crisis, I think is really important.
That's a fantastic idea. Absolutely. I think that's really, really important. It's been a lot of pressure for people in the last year. Thank you. Conscious of time, so I'm going to do one more question, and then we'll wrap up. So somebody's asked, it's good to hear you talk about collaboration. Have there been barriers to collaboration from a governance perspective that we need to think through for the future? Would anybody like to jump in before I pick on people?
I'm just going to say data sharing. We thought data sharing was a problem. Turns out when there's a pandemic and there's a will, I'm not saying we've solved it, but I think you're smiling as well, Edith, you'd agree, particularly with the NHS, there are barriers that you can remove. You just have to have the determination to do it.
I agree. Was there, would anybody else like to come in from the panel?
Yes, Andrew, I think one lesson for us was, don't be too proud, and if other people are leading the way and have great ideas, then join them rather than trying to reinvent the wheel yourselves. Fabulous.
Conscious of time, so I am going to wrap it up there. I can see that there was one more question in the field. So I'm very sorry to Philip that we've not had time to get to that, but after arriving late, I promised that I would promise James I would finish on time. So I just wanted to take a moment to say a big thank you to all of our speakers today. I've actually not worked with any of them before, and you've all been wonderful to work with. So thank you very, very much, but also for your very honest and candid responses to these things. I think, as I said before, it's always an opportunity to try and sell yourself for something, but it's really much more powerful to be honest about what we've been challenged with and how we've overcome that, and that's where the biggest learning happens. So thank you so much. London Funders are in the midst of, as you know, a festival of activities, and so we're really happy to take any conversations forward in the future. So if anything's come up at this session or any of the other sessions, or we haven't got to your question and you would like to continue that conversation, please do pick it up with London Funders. We're happy to help facilitate those conversations. We're happy to help make those things happen. They're generally a nice bunch of people, so please do get in touch. I was going to finish on some Glastonbury banter, which would have made more sense if I had started the conversation. But what I would say is that we are on day 4 of 6. And so thank you very much for coming and being our audience today. We appreciate all of the time that you've got, but I would say also take some time to stick your head into some of the other activities that London Funders are doing. That's when you discover some of the things you weren't really expecting, hear some different insights, and it really is an opportunity to hear some different things that are free that are being put on at the moment. We've already learned so much as a group, so please do take some time to do that. I was going to finish by saying that I'll be out the back selling some bootleg DVDs and tote bags if anybody would like to join us for #LondonLearnFest. If you haven't already, do join us on social media and help promote this. We've got 2 more days going, so it's plenty of time to get enjoyed and get part of it and to share it with other people. And I don't know about you, but in Redbridge it has been thunder and lightning and rain, so it very much is Glastonbury and very much is a mudfest. So thanks again for your time, and thank you to all of the panel for your involvement.
Thank you, Edith.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.